Welcome to the Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions webinar series. I'm Amelia Perkins. I serve as the Council's Director of Special Projects. Today's webinar welcomes Ahmed Rehab to speak about lessons from the Egyptian Revolution. Ahmed Rehab is an American Muslim activist and writer with a focus on contemporary social issues including civil rights, media relations, and Islam-West relations. He is currently the Executive Director of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, CAIR-Chicago, a Muslim rights organization and advocacy organization. Under Rehab's tenure, CAIR-Chicago has developed from a startup into one of the most notable non-for-profit civil rights offices of its kind anywhere in the United States. Welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. It is a pleasure to make it on the second attempt. The first time I was actually traveling through Turkey and did all the antics I possibly could do to be on, but unfortunately there were technical difficulties on my side and couldn't make it happen. So very glad to be on. It's an exciting topic for me. It's very much a live topic. It continues to unfold as we speak. The revolution, as we call it, has not ended. It's in session. Let me begin by saying that the Egyptian Revolution was a stereotype buster. It basically challenged a lot of the stereotypes that we hold here in the West, that many of us hold here in the West, vis-a-vis the Muslim world, or I should say the Muslim majority world, Egypt included, and particularly the Arab world. The notion that the Muslim majority world and the Arab world is forever stuck between dictatorship on one end with an Islamist, extremist, theological regime as the only alternative was shattered on the 25th and the 28th of January when Egyptians in the hundreds of thousands and later in the millions came out into the streets demanding a third alternative, stating that indeed there was something in between, and that's something we've called democracy, and that's what the people want. The notion that women were or are second-rate citizens in that part of the world with no political participation and no social substance also was shattered and challenged. We saw a lot of women, pretty much the same number as men in terms of the foot soldiers marching in that revolution, but also in terms of the leadership. After the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and after Mubarak resigned, and I started to make the rounds and meet with different youth leadership organizations, and I'll talk a little bit about the chronology after my intro. I saw women almost at every leadership table, sitting at the table, not as female leadership, but as leadership, period. Gender was not an issue in that revolution, and women were highly representatives, from calling God in the microphones and leading men and women in the streets all the way up to the meeting rooms and boardrooms of the youth coalition movements. The notion, and this is a stereotype that was also held in Egypt itself, that the youth were lackadaisical, good for nothing, only interested in fashion and music and the latest fads, and really politically apathetic. Also was really challenged in the sense that this was a youth revolution because it was youth-led. I mean, the revolution itself pretty much had everybody from every walk of life involved, but it was youth organized, youth planned, and youth implemented in terms of the leadership. The stereotype that violence permeates all of the dealings of the Middle East also was challenged on its face, this being one of the most peaceful revolutions in the history of mankind, if you consider the number of people that were there in the streets at one point in time. We're talking about 12 million people in total over the various moments of this revolution, 12 million people participating out of 80 million. And it was mostly, to a great extent, a peaceful revolution. Where there was violence, it was instigated by security forces that were aligned with Mubarak and the ousted regime, and met with some resistance from the youth groups. But for the most part, it was a white, peaceful revolution. And when you contrast that with the gold standard of revolutions up until that, the Egyptian Revolution, which was the French Revolution, a very bloody, and violent revolution, again, the notion that the Middle East is somehow more violent than the West is turned on its face. And then lastly, again, the notion that Christians and Muslims in the Middle East or in the Arab world or in Egypt cannot, coexist or live together. We saw in Tahrir Square, the central square of Cairo where this movement materialized, and elsewhere in Egypt, we saw great camaraderie between Christians and Muslims. In Egypt, the Christians are mostly Copts. It's an East Orthodox church. And we saw, they marched side by side. There was no sense of you're Christian, I'm Muslim. We were all Egyptian, and that's what mattered. Post the revolution, post the initial, weeks and months of the revolution, there has been some isolated strife, sectarian or religious strife, but it had context to it, and it was shunned and condemned by the majority of people. So there is a very clear commitment to moving forward as one with the widely accepted notion that any division between the religions in Egypt was mostly manufactured by the previous regime in order to keep people more or less out of politics and sort of concerned with other more important priorities such as survival. So that sort of, tells you a little bit about why this revolution is considered so important historically and why it can offer lessons to the relationship or to the relations that we call East-West relations or, American-Arab relations. It can be a start of a new era, a new phase that hopefully will be reciprocated, that we see American foreign policy begin to also change and not simply consider the Middle East as a time bomb or a place where resources are plentiful and there are economic opportunities, but a place where there's civilization, where there's culture, where there's economic opportunity that goes beyond resources, goes beyond the oil and the gas, the human resources, the business, the trade, the education, the cultural exchange. Right now, the youth are taking the bull by the horns. They're involved in every aspect of negotiation and leadership, and I think that they are very, at least I should say, attuned to Western ways. They're not, they grew up on American film and music, and a lot of them speak English. So, it can be a new era, I think, of cooperation. I think we on this end of the pond also need to become more culturally aware of Egypt and the Middle East and the Arab world. So backing up to my personal experience and the chronology of this revolution, I arrived in Egypt from Chicago on January 22nd, which was 3 days before the revolution broke out. And I had gone there with my parents who were going on vacation and had been asking me to go, and I had really been against going simply because I had so much work back here at CAIR-Chicago. But when I got word of what then was a planned protest, a large protest, but not nearly deemed a revolution, I don't think anybody could have imagined what this would have turned into, I decided that, that this sort of gave me the extra push. I wanted to be there for that. I felt that this could be something serious. Not as serious as that, but something serious nonetheless that I wanted to be part of. I had always been, I always counted myself as opposition when it comes to Egyptian politics. A critic of the Mubarak regime, of this, sort of stagnant and sometimes remedial and backward government that is the Mubarak regime. And, it's the fallouts, the economic fallouts, the sectarian fallouts, the cultural, the foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. So this was, my anger, my frustration, my love for Egypt, all the motivations. I ended up going there on the 22nd. On the 25th, I, was amongst some of the first Egyptians that were there in the streets, and amongst some of the first that were kicked out of the streets. Some of us actually were able to stay longer through midnight. This was the only group that was able to make it to Tahrir Square that day. And there's an interesting story here that tells you a little bit about the, I think, what one could call ingenious planning of these youth groups. So this was basically advertised on Facebook, on a Facebook fan page, amongst other places. And it was a Facebook page that was dedicated to the memory of a certain Khalid Said, who's a young man from the Mediterranean port of Alexandria that was an activist against police brutality, himself a victim of police brutality as a result of his activism. He was pulled out of an internet cafe where he was working, basically, in public, in the light of day, taken to an undisclosed location, beaten into a pulp, murdered, and his corpse thrown, his battered and bruised corpse thrown back onto the streets in front of that internet cafe. Now, even by Mubarak standards, and I don't for a second want you to think this is life as usual. I mean, this was an extreme situation, and even bad people, were sort of, wow, this is extreme. And so it did. Although police brutality was there already, it's been there for years. This was sort of like over the edge, and it did result in a certain movement, in a culmination of the anger happening. And so there was part of that was a Facebook page called "We Are All Khaled Said," a page that was in memory but also in defiance of the police and police brutality. And the 25th of January was picked because that's Police Day, a celebration in Egypt for the police, to serve and protect. Slogan, etc. And it was meant to be on that day to challenge that the police doesn't do any of this. So that's what we're going out for. And so on the 25th, the planning happened mostly secretly as usual. The police, especially the right police and the security, state security, is used to having attempted protests, but they never get anywhere. They always fizzle away pretty early on because the police gets to the upper. This is how they do it. They send their huge, deep blue Italian trucks that intimidate a lot of people. All these guys dressed in black top to bottom with their guns and shields come out like ants. They surround the area. They're there before you are. They give you limited space to yell and scream, and brandish your tickets, and then they basically begin to threaten you and either disperse you or you leave yourself. So they thought this would be business as usual. And indeed it was in all places but one. And again, this comes back to the ingenious planning. So basically the way it happened was the youth organizing groups, they had actually been planning this for a while. They ran through dry runs, and here was the plan. They basically went into the slums of Cairo, the poorer neighborhoods, and practiced the sloganeering that they thought would mostly appeal to that population. And it wasn't a gimmick. It was, good-willed. They really wanted to appeal because they understood every segment of society had its grievances. And they wanted to make sure that they actually could reach over and connect. So they talked about bread. They talked about the food crisis. They talked about unemployment. And they found a certain response in that neighborhood. And so they then practiced secretly, dividing themselves into 10 groups of 10, with only one leader in each of those groups, one out of the 10 in each of the groups of 10, knowing the plan. And they started in 10 different locations in that same neighborhood, and they had different maps that would see the 10 groups converge at the same time in the same spot within that neighborhood. And as they moved through the streets, those groups of 10 were calling those same slogans that they had practiced that were appealing to that population and starting to snowball. And then they sort of poured in and converged into that one spot, unbeknownst to the police, almost organically, as if organically. And once they were in that central spot, which was by a closed candy store, they then had what we would call critical mass. And then as they moved out towards the main street, now being a large number, people were encouraged. It was easier to snowball even further. By the time they hit the main street and the police got word of it, and a battalion was sent over, they were just too much for the police to deal with. That ended up being the only group out of 9 different locations that day that made it into Tahrir Square because of that plan. The rest of us were apparently decoy and were kicked out. So they were there in Tahrir Square. This was significant because Tahrir Square had never been claimed before, except I think sometime in the 70s where it ended brutally. But they were there peacefully, and they were there through midnight. Eventually the police ganged up on them with water hoses and other types of police gear, weapons, and basically evacuated the place. My friends and I had come back into the Tahrir Square area by that time. There had been offshoots, of not riots, but marches, again, in the slums. We looked for the only surviving one at the time it was midnight and joined it until we were dispersed, facing police violence at 3 a.m. that night. For the next 2 days, it was chaos from the police side, from the state side. They canceled first Facebook, then they canceled Twitter, then they canceled the entire internet in Egypt, then they shut off all mobile systems, and they shut off phones like landlines. So essentially there was no way to communicate whatsoever. And this was in apprehension and in preparation for Friday, which was the first Friday since the revolution broke out, the 28th. So the 25th was a Tuesday, 28th would be a Friday. The reason why Friday is significant is because it's the Sabbath in Egypt, a Muslim country, and it's where people congregate naturally in huge numbers at the various many mosques around the country. So it's for the Friday prayer, for the Friday sermon prayer. So it was a natural, sort of mobilizing event that the government feared, and rightly so. Now, to give you a little bit of insight, because you know the results, but I want you to go back and live the moment as we did. This was the first time that anybody was attempting something like this. We knew the state to be ruthless, the police to be brutal. Every attempt have failed, but there was a sense of belief. There was a sense of belief because of what happened in Tunisia, which had a successful revolution before us, and because of the anger that was bubbling up in the sense that we can't go back. We got the Tahrir Square for a couple of hours. That encouraged us as well, and there was this sort of this spirit, this you could feel it, even though there was no means of communication anymore. So I met with a bunch of my close friends at my apartment in Heliopolis, which is a suburb of Cairo, on a Thursday night. And by that time, there was no means of communication. We talked, we asked ourselves, do you think this is over? Is there going to be anything tomorrow? And what do you think? We took opinions. Some of us said, yeah, it's probably over as usual. We're not hearing anything. Others said, well, I don't think it's over. And then we ended up deciding that we're going to go. We're going to be prepared. If something happens, we're going to jump straight into it. We're not going to instigate anything ourselves, so we're not the fools, the five fools that get pulled aside as everybody else is quiet and going about their business. But as soon as we sense any movement, we have to really get our senses keen on any clues around us. We're in there. So just to make sure that we found the action, we ended up going to this one mosque that had a reputation for being an activist mosque. We figured if something was going to happen, little did we know what was going to happen. We figured if something even small was going to happen, it would at least be there. So we took a cab, had the cab, it's quite a distance, had a cab drop us off at a corner, walked around the corner because we don't want, the state security seeing us get out of a cab, which kind of gives us away as nobody goes to a mosque in a cab. There's a mosque in every street corner unless you're there for a reason. And as we walked into the mosque, the first clues were there. We could see the battalions, the black riot gear, blue trucks, the whole 9 yards. They were lined up all over the place around this mosque. So I'd never really prayed in an atmosphere. So it's very intimidating. We were a little late, so we're in the overflow section outside, which later proved to be fortunate for us. We're in the garden. The sermon started. The imam, or the priest, so to speak, began to talk about, my sons, I know that, I understand you have issues. I understand you're angry. I understand you have, legitimate demands. I support them. Before you can go on, there is huge applause. Nobody ever applauds in a sermon. It's usually not part of the etiquette. So this was sort of a, clue that, this was a pretty politically aware, charged up crowd, really sort of clenching its teeth, but there was something bubbling underneath. And then he goes, but, Mubarak is a father to us. We have to give him time. We have to be patient. Change doesn't happen overnight. A good Muslim has to be patient. No response from the crowd whatsoever. Silence. The prayer starts. The silence proceeds to storm, I guess. You almost hear the fluttering of the trees. And at that point, our heart is beating because the prayer is about to end. And we're about to find out what the heck's going on. No sooner had the priest or the imam finished the prayer than one guy just stood up right into the silence of the park, the garden, and starts to chant, down, down with Hosni Mubarak. And right away, everybody in that mosque, maybe 3,000 people, chanted right back after him. And then flags came out of jacket pockets, picket signs, I don't know from where it came out, and suddenly it looked like it was a demonstration within seconds. The riot police started to jog around to try to curb us in. We decided to flow into the street, being at the very back of this overflow section. When we turned around, I was suddenly in the front of the push, and we easily went through the riot police. They didn't know what to do with us. I think we just took them by surprise and flowed into the street. This was a key moment. We felt, okay, this could be our day. We're in the street. We're in large numbers. We're doing something. It's not going to be a quiet day. They didn't silence us by shutting off communication. At this point, we don't know if it's just us in this mosque or elsewhere as well, people in the streets are just, stunned to see the sight. People just suddenly exploding into the street with colors, slogans, yelling, chanting. They joined us, and as we marched through the main streets, obviously by that point the police had sort of taken out traffic, and it was very clear. We were beginning to really grow, really blossom in numbers. As we marched, we were singing, patriotic songs, calling for people to come down from their buildings to join us. Saying things like, Egyptian, this is your day. You be in the streets. Don't be at home. Join your families. Join your friends. That kind of thing. And calling for freedom, calling for democracy. From the very beginning, these were our demands. When we went on the 25th, it was about police brutality and about a certain set of reforms. At this point, because of the grave mistakes of the government, because of its defiance, because of its disrespect, and complete disavowal for what the citizen meant and the legitimate demands, the anger had bubbled into a full-out demand for the regime to be fallen, and we were going to make it happen peacefully. So now that had changed, and that was part of our sloganeering. As we marched through the main streets of this rather affluent suburb, by the time we got to the end of the main street, I couldn't see the end of the street. I couldn't see the end of the crowd. It went all the way to the horizon. The police filed, or the soldiers filed in a single, marched in a single file next to us on the pavement as we marched through the streets themselves. We turned corners, went over bridges, walked for about an hour, finally got to the main square. There was a couple of bridges away from Tahrir Square in downtown Cairo, and then, whereas we had thought this was all going to be peaceful, this was going to be a piece of cake, the police was just going to buckle under this kind of pressure, we were then faced with the other side of the story. A huge fortification of armored trucks and police on the bridges, and they started immediately to just lunge at us tear gas. This was the first time we had ever experienced such an attack. You're talking about street warfare, and I, just like you, probably, had never experienced it before. It felt out of place. It felt strange. I had only seen it on television. This was my city, my street, my country. I'd never seen it like this. It was a very surreal moment. People started to run. A lot of the elderly, a lot of the children, a lot of the mothers with kids sort of dispersed, but a lot of people stayed behind, those that could brave the battle. But we were pushed back a little bit. And the first experience of getting the tear gas smoke into your lungs, nose, mouth, and ears, eyes, was just, again, surreal. You lose all command of your senses. You feel like you can't breathe. You feel like you're really itching. Your eyes are watering. Confusingly, you're sneezing or coughing. And some of us are almost suffocating. There were some preparations. People had vinegar bottles and napkins that doused the napkins, put them over their eyes and nose, or Coke bottles that would have the same effect. Try to wash things out with water, and you squat down for a few minutes until the effects go away. There's no way, you can't run from it. You can't do anything about it. It's a horrible experience. After getting pummeled with a couple of those, we try to regroup, and then as usual that day there was always a vanguard of young, brave, youth citizens that would just charge, and they would have the decisive command to say, let's go. We're not going to sit here. We're not going to go back. Let's go. And then to go right at them, they will come back, badly injured, wounded, sometimes killed, but they would cause the entire mob or the large group of people to move over. And this happened throughout the day. As we pushed and they fought back, we were hit with shrapnels. We were hit with bullets that were, rubber bullets that can cause grievous injury, sometimes death. We were hit with the tear gas and with batons for those that could reach. They were badly beaten and sometimes badly wounded or killed. And we kept on doing this, bridge after bridge, street after street. They'd push on us, we'd run, we'd come back, we'd push on them, back and forth, hours on end. This continued. I'll spare you the details. It's on my blog, but there were interesting moments, interesting side battles, interesting times in which we thought this was over. It was just meeting people that were stuck somewhere. We thought everybody else had left, and then we'd come back and find a large group, and suddenly we'd meet the whole world again. This kept on going until around 5 o'clock when we received massive reinforcements from those that were coming from the Giza, the pyramids area. And they were still fresh in fresh clothes. Clearly they had just arrived, and we had been all bruised and tattered and battered. It was just receiving that reinforcement. The voices were still strong. We were singing. The flags were still nice and fresh. It rebooted us. It gave us a lot of passion again, and this gave us the extra push to to go right back into the main streets and keep on pushing the police. This continued until dusk, and then through sunset, until finally, after many battles, and at this point we're close to the main Tahrir Square itself. We were just at its gates. At this point, you can see, fire bombs. You can see snipers from buildings. You can see trucks going on fire. People dousing their jackets in gasoline and just sticking them in the trucks to try to evacuate the soldiers. Finally, at around 7 p.m., we got into Tahrir Square, and the entire police force in Egypt had left the streets. We were amongst the last the last battalion was fighting us. When it left, that was it. We then learned that this had been happening at every mosque, every church even. People had been coming from all over Cairo, in other cities as well, the main cities, smaller cities. It wasn't just us. It was a full-fledged revolution, and it was everywhere. And so we were ecstatic to be in Tahrir Square. You can still see the smoke. It was barely recognizable. The pristine sort of central touristy area that we used to now looked like a war zone. The smoke, the flames, the people banging on metal, people yelling, screaming, singing, shouting, crying, hugging each other. At that point, we didn't know what had happened, or what would happen, rather, until a Jeep came sort of speeding right into the crowd. And at first I thought, oh crap, they're getting reinforcements from the army. Now we got to fight the army. But those who were better informed than me, locals, so as to speak, then stated that, or started to yell, "It's the army!" Like almost happily. And I like, yeah, it's the army. Let's run. Why are you happy? And they explained to me that no, it means that Mubarak is losing power. So apparently, as I later learned in the world, that when things get tough and the government is about to fall, the Egyptian military, that's the system in Egypt, steps in and takes command of security, especially when there's no police force. This is to prevent any foreign enemies or forces taking advantage of the security vacuum. But it also maintains local security as well. But it doesn't mitigate between citizens, it just mitigates between citizens and foreign threats and citizens and the government. So the military came in and maintained that distance. Did not involve itself politically, but it did in security fashion. We started to see the tanks roll in over the bridges. Again, a strange sight, this very urban area filled with tanks rolling in. Where cars had once, ruled the road, it was tanks and other military vehicles. And the president finally was going to, excuse me, to address the nation for the first time since this whole crisis began. We hurried home, watched his first speech, and in short, it was too little too late. He talked about changing the cabinet and the ministry, did not acknowledge his own problems and the fact that we wanted him out of there. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I apologize. Unfortunately, we're fasting, so I can't drink water unless I'm really dying, which I'm not yet. It's Ramadan, for those of you that don't know, the holy month of fasting in Islam. Anyway, and so immediately a decision was made for those who were in Tahrir Square still that they would have a vigil and they would not leave. And at first it was a few thousand, and then it was tens of thousands, and then after again more mistakes from the government, more bad speeches, more defiance, more attempts at insulting our intelligence and undermining our peaceful and honest and legitimate demands for freedom and democracy. Especially the camel incident where there was an attack, a brutal attack on the peaceful demonstrators in Tahrir Square by minions of the former president, business partners who brought their thugs that worked for them, hired them on horses and camels and swords and whips and other stuff to come in and terrorize the people. And this battle raged on later with guns as well and other street-made weapons, improvised weapons for 2 nights or 2 days. And it became a huge fiasco in Egypt. It was a huge scandal. And mind you, camels are not you may think again that for the average Egyptian, this was like what, a WTF moment. I mean, camels just are not in Cairo. They're not in the streets. So it was really weird even for Egyptians, okay? And it was just kind of like, this is totally surreal. So when this happened, and when we saw that people there were just defending themselves, they looked normal, because before then the government was saying, the media, state media was saying, oh, these are all, like they're saying in Syria now and in Libya, these are all foreign mercenaries, they've been trained abroad, this is Israel, this is the United States, this is Iran, this is Qatar, this is Al Jazeera, this is everybody in the world but Mubarak. And some people, gullible, politically, unconscious, believed it. And so there was a little bit of a sort of a backfiring or a counter-revolutionary movement up until that time. So this was sort of, when they made this fatal mistake, it kind of served our purpose to help us, because then people began to see that, wait a second, these are like my sons and your sons, my brothers, sisters, and yours, etc. My daughters and your daughters. And so it was a turning point. And also when Wael Ghunaim, the guy who was running this Facebook page I told you about, he was kidnapped on the 28th, and he wasn't released until a week later. And he came on television on a major primetime show, sort of our Oprah, and he had a very honest, sincere performance, I should say performance, sort of presence, and he was weeping about, the martyrs, the dead youth, good, brilliant students with great futures, dead because of police brutality, because of the government defiance. And he felt responsible for that. He was saying, it wasn't my fault. We're just trying to do what's right for the country. And, he was kidnapped. He talked about his story. This interview was another turning point. These two turning points changed the revolution around, brought us more critical mass for those who haven't been in the streets, and more millions in the streets later on different Fridays. And this movement continued, and the Tahrir Square Republic began, as they say, as we call it. This Tahrir Square Republic basically meant that we were seeing Egyptians come together in camaraderie, in total peaceful demonstration and demand for freedom and democracy. This was where we saw people provide food for each other, blankets for each other, cover for each other. There were people cleaning. Again, this is all improvised. This is all organically created. Volunteer citizen groups that would provide security. They would do checkups and checkpoints as people walked in. They didn't have to do that. They did that because they didn't want the state, media, or anybody else to accuse them of letting in those who ended up being violent. They wanted to keep it totally peaceful. The way they provided medical care, it was all citizens working for each other, almost its own republic. And at the same time, there were those in the media, key intellectuals, key writers, key politicians from the opposition that were saying the right thing and pushing back. But still, there was a terrible state media disseminating all these lies in defiance of the president. And this continued, this push and pull, this shove and tug, continued with the demands of Tahrir Square growing ever louder. There was music, there was a stage that was provided by donors with huge screens and sound system. There were songs that were created just with. I mean, when we think back to the Tahrir Square movement itself, that period, it's probably the most meaningful to us for this, because we saw the best of what Egypt had to offer. We saw Christians and Muslims together. When Muslims would pray, and there was a prayer that was called during, it was time for prayer, during the 28th when we're pushing over those bridges under heavy fire. The Christians amongst us created a human wall around us so we could pray. And we invited the Christians in Tahrir Square to hold a mass on our Friday, on our Sabbath. And so there was all of these, very important touches, compassionate reach out between people. You couldn't tell rich from poor in Tahrir Square. They were together. You couldn't tell old from young. There were professionals and there were blue-collar workers. There were Christians and Muslims. There were men and women. Everything. There was everybody there. It was truly a populist revolution. Until the 11th, when we finally got our way and under immense pressure. And by that point in time, I'd been amongst those who marched to the presidential palace in Heliopolis, which is in my neighborhood. From Tahrir Square, we marched all the way there. We got there, and 3 hours later, we basically heard the great news that he was leaving. And we heard this from his vice president, who also left with him. There was massive eruption of celebrations. I didn't actually receive word. I just saw apparently everybody who had a phone in that area by the presidential palace, there were in the tens of thousands, suddenly just received the same text message, and I just heard everybody just yell and scream and start to hug and cry and everything else. And it occurred to me what had happened. I didn't receive the text myself. And so we're just celebrating, we're ecstatic, and this biggest party I've ever seen in my life. The entire nation was jubilating well into the night and into the next day. This started the next phase of the revolution, the army taking over as a custodian, the youth movements organizing and creating political parties, and we continue in this space. I'm very involved in this space. The last week I had, after the Mubarak left on the 11th of February, I spent filming a documentary with some American filmmaker friends of mine about the revolution. We met with some of the celebrities in Egypt that I had come to know, and some of the key activists and some politicians, etc. We're in the process of editing. And I also spent some time building relationships with youth leadership movements with which I'm involved right now. As a consultant, as an unpaid consultant, as a volunteer, and I'm one of the founders of this coalition. During the revolution itself, I played three roles, so to speak: being in the streets like everybody else, blogging about my experience and what I was seeing to the Western world, or the Western audience, and running interviews, 50 of them, with CNN, BBC, Fox, all that, over my cell phone. And that was probably the biggest risk I was taking, because during that time there was a lot of demonization of those who had dual citizenship like myself, and anybody who talked to the West was considered a traitor or part of a conspiracy, all that state media garbage. So I felt threatened by that, especially when Anderson Cooper left. He never leaves anything. This guy's been through tsunamis, hurricanes, war zones, earthquakes, stuff. When he left to protect himself, to save his life, basically, I was like, oh, okay, this is not good at all. But we survived it, and fortunately nothing happened to me. And we lived to celebrate and feel like we were part of something great. I'm here now to tell you about it. So I'll close there and turn it back to the moderator.
Ahmed, thank you so much. It's really a gift to hear your firsthand account. We now have 3 respondents, and then hopefully we'll have a little time to return to Ahmed with questions from our listeners. So our first respondent today is Rabbi Nancy Fuchs Kramer. Rabbi Fuchs Kramer is Director of the Department of Multi-Faith Studies and Initiatives and Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. Wow. It was a very powerful story, and made more powerful by my feeling connected to it only tangentially. Mona El-Tahawi, who many of you probably saw commenting, an Egyptian-American journalist, is a friend of mine, and I followed very avidly her comments throughout that period of time. And it struck me, both talking to Mona and listening to you today, how important relationships are, and how relationships are really what it's all about. And I'm thinking Ronit, who I don't know personally, will be speaking in a few minutes, and watching her films has been so important to me as an American Jew, and being able to learn about Israelis, children were victims of violence and who then worked together, learning about a town in the West Bank that did nonviolent protests. These are the fact of stories and human relationships are central, and it's actually what we try to do at RRC, where I teach. The rabbinical students have book learning about most things, but when it comes to interreligious work, we try as much as possible to pair them with people from the other faiths, learn, study together, do service together, do anything to actually get to know each other. I don't know that I can add much about Egypt, and I certainly have been following as much as possible what's going on in Israel right now in the streets, and I'll leave that to Ronit, who has many more connections to Israel than I do probably, and has more to say about how that connects to the story we just heard. The one thing that I might add to all of this is American Muslim-Jewish relationships, which I have found have been watching this for a while now, and I think that it's interesting to me how much the Egyptian revolution may have, as you said, busted stereotypes, important busting of some stereotypes with certain American Jews, and a warming up of understanding about Muslims in general. The general thing that I can say about this is that the American Jewish community is bimodal, and there are those who are very much sympathetic and feel warmly toward Muslim Americans and feel connected with their story as immigrants, as a religious minority, as a group that has a faith that they're trying to figure out how to live in the 21st century, that is in so many ways connected. And at the same time, there's also the other side of it, which is that there's a lot of misunderstanding, misinformation, fear, and general, I would say, carrying over from Middle East antagonism, a sense of somehow that this is a zero-sum game. They win, we lose. And the interesting thing for me is seeing how to address that, how to move that forward, how to move the people. And some people, by the way, are in the middle. I'd say the vast majority are a little of both. And what I found is exactly listening to a story like this is exactly the way, one of the ways of helping people see the humanity and then the complexity, and then being able to understand that this isn't about the Muslims, they're violent. It's about the story of Ahmed. It's the story of Mona. It's a story of an individual who they come to know. So I think that's pretty much all I have to say, and that Robert Putnam's book, American Grace, has a wonderful chapter about this very fact. He talks about it as the Aunt Susan phenomenon. And if any of you haven't read American Grace by Harvard professor Robert Putnam, it's a thick book about American religion right now and about intergroup relations, and has a lot of interesting observations, but in particular about the question of how Americans feel toward different groups, including Muslims, which you might not be surprised to know come down near the bottom. By the way, Jews are near the top, which is a surprise to everybody, especially Jews. In fact, most Jews refuse to believe this information and say that Robert Putnam is wrong. But in any case, they can't take that news. Jews will not take that news and believe it. But in any event, Robert Putnam's observation is that group relations warm up when people know someone because cousin Julie is married to a Jew, or somebody in their family has had that kind of relationship, and then that changes everything. That's all I have to say, and thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Our next respondent is Dr. Paul Wee. Dr. Wee is an adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University and pastor of the Aromo Evangelical Church in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Amelia. And thank you very much, Ahmed and Rabbi Nancy, too, for your remarks. You know, when you tell the story with all of its color, it is really a dimension that we don't always hear, and it makes the heartbeat a little bit faster. You know, I think of the other relatively peaceful resolutions of recent times, the fall of the Berlin Wall, '89, and then, of course, the release of Nelson Mandela coming to power in South Africa. These were really movements of the people that moved those revolutions. And I look at what's happening now in Egypt in that same vein. At least I hope it will be what the churches sometimes call a moment of kairos. That is that Greek word, a right time, where the foundations shake, where things are called in question, where you wait for something new to happen. Of course, they're very dangerous times, but also times filled with a great deal of hope. I guess my question would be, Ahmed, is that as you talked rightly about the sometimes Western view of a dichotomy, Islam on a more extremist side and Western democracy on the other side, that dichotomy has really been shattered by this. And I think that's very true. Although Egypt, and I think of the Muslim Brotherhood in the last 30 years, and it may have started in violence, of course, and the assassination of the Prime Minister and the attempted assassination of Nasser and all of that. The last 30 years, it has become, it seems to me at least from a distance, a model of the compatibility of Islam and democracy. It has been a hopeful movement quite prior to the springtime. Yet at the same time, in recent weeks especially, I must say I have some doubts about where this is going. There have been some statements from the Muslim Brotherhood, from some within that movement that have been not so hospitable, that have called for a theocracy, have called for an Islamic state, have called for Sharia law. There are anecdotal, and maybe that is not the right word, but incidents where Christians and Muslims have really stood together, as you have said. But it's troubling also to hear those statements from within a group that is well organized and might, get, I don't know how much, 30% of the vote, but there's still no acceptance really of Israel's right to exist. There's no real reaching out of the hand to religious communities. I mean, I would like to think that they will not have the final word, but I really would like to hear from you on this question.
Paul, what we'll do is we'll hear from Ronit, and then we'll give Ahmed the last word.
Very good. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So our next respondent, before we give Ahmed the floor, and perhaps Ahmed, most of the questions coming in are about really what's happening now. So if you could address that a little bit. And our next respondent is Ronit Avni. Ronit is an award-winning filmmaker, human rights advocate, and media strategist with an expertise in Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution efforts. Ms. Avni is the founder and executive director of Just Vision, a nonprofit organization that researches, documents, and creates media about Palestinian and Israeli grassroots leaders in nonviolent and peace-building work. So welcome, Ronit.
Thank you so much. So just FYI, my name is Ronit. It's a tough pronounce, but just so you all know. And it's really an honor to hear you speak, Ahmed. It's so funny because our work is very, very much focused on nonviolent movement building at the moment. And we had made a film called Budrus that we released. It premiered at the Dubai International Film Festival in 2009 and there was an Egyptian journalist there. The film is about a nonviolent movement in Palestinian society that succeeds in saving the village's lands, and they do it entirely through non-resistance. And Egyptian journalists could not believe the story was true. They could not believe that nonviolent organizing could yield the results that it did. And it's been so amazing to see what happened in Egypt. I wish that I could be a journalist today, because I think that the situation has so dramatically changed in terms of, the world's perception about the efficacy of nonviolent revolution. Obviously, we've had histories of it in context around the world, India and South Africa, and the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, etc. But a real contemporary example since the collapse of the Soviet Union has been lacking, and so it's such a gift to the world. What Tunisia and then Egypt have contributed, even with all of the instability and everything now that is uncertain. I'm not an Egypt expert. One of our board members, Jahan Noujem, is an Egyptian American like you and was there during that time and is making a film, so I'd love to connect the two of you to make sure you're coordinated. So we certainly followed what was going on. Mona as well, who Nancy mentioned, is also a friend of our organization. But we followed it also for its impact on the work that we're doing. So nonviolence is not new to the Arab world. It's not new to the Middle East. It's interesting that the first Intifada was largely nonviolent. It was actually mostly nonviolent, and the West's understanding of the first Intifada is very much about a violent uprising. But if you go back and study it and look at the archives and the footage of what happened and really do an analysis, the vast majority of it was actually a popular nonviolent resistance. In the absence of an Al Jazeera and in the absence of Facebook and Twitter and all of these tools that could communicate to the world what was going on. So it's been for us a blessing because we had been talking about the power of ordinary civilians to make change on the ground and the power of nonviolence to effect change. Now, whereas we were sometimes met with skepticism or fatigue, there is an energy that is permeating both Palestinian and Israeli society. Interestingly, in Palestinian society, I think there's a little bit of exhaustion because there is a real feeling that they had tried this during the first Intifada and it didn't yield the results that they had sought out. I think there are some lessons for Egypt from that. Many of the nonviolence leaders of the first Intifada say that their biggest strategic mistake was that they stopped it when the leadership changed, rather than continuing until an actual agreement was reached that could be acceptable to both populations. And looking at Egypt now with Mubarak's fall, I think there's a big question of when does a nonviolent movement end, and how does it transition, and how do you maintain pressure even as that transition is going on? So I look forward to your update as to what's happening on the ground. Just a couple of little other ripple effects that are happening in the region. And it's interesting, last night I actually had dinner with a Syrian nonviolence activist, and we were talking a lot about the levels of coordination that had been happening in Syria and some that had been happening in Egypt, but also in other contexts, just how key that is. So I think, Nancy, I appreciate your point about knowing the individual and telling the other's story, and I think in the peace-building phase and the reconciliation phase and the post-transition phase, that's critical. But I think in terms of trying to achieve structural change, that planning, that understanding of how influence and power works, not power in terms of the use of force, but in terms of how do you coordinate, how do you organize to make sure that different constituencies are aligned. And to do that under a regime, a dictatorial regime, is so tremendously courageous that I just want to acknowledge how humbled I felt watching. It's interesting, I was in Davos as Egypt was unfolding, and the head of the Arab League was Amr Moussa, and many, many people were there at the time, and people were sort of holding their breath and trying to figure out how to respond. And I think people really didn't understand what was coming. I know that the State Department, we did a screening of Budrus one day, and the State Department intelligence analysts were telling them, these diplomats who were stationed across the Middle East, that Mubarak had won. This was the American intelligence analysis of what was going on, and it was so clear to people watching television that that's not what was happening. And so I just want us to keep our eye on the grassroots and to really appreciate the level of courage, but also the importance of coordination in the context of these circumstances.
Oh, thanks so much, Ronit. That's great. Ahmed, shall you?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
We'd love you to have the last word.
Okay. Thank you. I want to thank Rabbi Nancy, Dr. Paul, and Ronit for their very thought-provoking responses and questions. And also I want to thank you, in case I don't have time, Amelia, and also Matt Black for your wonderful coordination of this event. All right, let's begin with this. I've always maintained that the formula for a successful revolution in Egypt or elsewhere in the Arab world, or pretty much anywhere in the world today, is composed of three things. Number one is numbers. You need a critical mass. Number two is persistence. Whatever happens, you're going to stick to it. And number three is nonviolence, and it's the most important one of the three. So long as you're nonviolent and you have the numbers and you never give up, you will get there. Whatever happens, you'll get there. You know, there'll be sacrifices, but who's going to live forever anyway? You know, we're doing the right thing, and we stick it out, and it works. So I think it's going to happen in Syria if they follow that formula. You know, any of those three things change, and I can't guarantee success. In Syria or Libya or elsewhere, if you turn violent, it's not the same formula. If there isn't the critical numbers, even if you're peaceful and persistent, not good enough. And if you're not persistent, if you give up, even if you're peaceful with large numbers, you're just going to compromise too early. So that's the formula. Going back to the stereotype list. I apologize. Going back to the stereotype busting, another major one is that, you know, there was this feeling, especially here in the political circles in D.C., that if change were to happen in the Middle East, it would happen either through a military junta, you know, a coup, military coup, as is quote-unquote typical of the third world, or from the United States, and this is on the neocon side, you know, waddling in with our benevolent export of democracy as if it was some, you know, weapon. And that's what, you know, the Bush regime, some believe, tried to do and failed miserably in Iraq. And, or a religious clerical overthrow. All of that, again, was turned on its face. This was the youth who were not necessarily politicized and definitely not of a religious disposition, you know, challenging a brutal, entrenched regime with nothing but their voice and their belief in themselves and the future of their country, not because of their religious direction or their or Israel or America or any of that stuff, but because of human rights, because of freedoms in Egypt, because of corruption, because of opportunity, because of the economy and the food prices. Kind of the same things that move Israelis in the streets today. I believe the same thing that moves people in Spain and Greece and England. The same things that move people in Syria and Libya. These are universal demands, and these are universal aspirations. And what I'm seeing here is an opportunity for the world. If the people are more in charge, you know, more and more in charge, and these leaders that really, it turns out, represent nobody, begin to follow the people rather than the other way around. You know, I want Egyptians to deal with Israelis as people to people. I don't want the mediation of, in my humble opinion, and excuse me for saying so, fools like Mubarak and Netanyahu or Arafat or Lieberman. I don't want these individuals who have a political agenda, perhaps personal in nature, to put people up against each other. In Egypt today, there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity where the people want to understand and to deal with facts. They're not interested in rhetoric. We've been through that with Nasser, for those of you who are familiar with that history. It was moving at the time, but later turned out to be, you know, just fluff. We want, this is a practical world we live in. This is a globalized world. There's the internet. There's, you know, cell phones, satellite systems. People get to hear and see each other more and more. You can't fool the people as you used to be able to. Yes, Dr. Paul, there are concerns, but you know what? We've got to differentiate between the micro history and the macro history. If you look at the micro history, every day brings different feelings. You'll talk to me on a Tuesday, I'll say, oh my God, this is wonderful. It's totally succeeding. Talk to me on Wednesday or Thursday, I'll say, oh, it's not going to work. But in the long run, in the bigger picture, it's going in the right direction. Like any revolution, and I'm sure those who lived through the French Revolution weren't getting the soundbite results that we talk about today. That it was the birth of democracy in France. I'm sure back then, especially through the 3 years of terror that immediately followed the French Revolution, they were thinking this was the worst thing ever to happen to France. We're not facing 3 years of terror or even months of terror. There is no terror. There is, of course, chaos in some areas. There are some challenges, and it's just normal and natural for revolutions. The key is for us to always recalibrate, and that's where I feel optimistic. The youth, the people, they know Tahrir Square, they know where it's at, they have the Fridays in the week, they get there when they need to, and they put the right pressure on the right people to move things forward. Anybody who tries to sabotage the revolution, from the far-right Islamists to the Copts who have relationships from outside Egypt and have different agenda, to the far leftists or whatever else a group with personal agenda, they're challenged by this majority. In terms of I'll close with a couple of words about my personal politics on this matter. I personally, I believe in democracy. I believe that it's the only system that can allow a pluralist civilization to flourish. And I believe that as a Muslim. I believe that the only thing I want from the state, I don't believe in political Islam in the sense that there should be a religious state. I don't believe in a religious state. I believe the only thing the state ought to do is allow for the freedom of religion. And that is it. That vis-a-vis religion. That is all I need. Because once you do that, then it's left to civil society to live whatever religious life they think is fit. The government, the state, ought not dictate to the people how to live, how to find God, and how to be good Muslims or Christians or Jews. That's something that they should be given the freedom to do as they please. And once they have that freedom, they shouldn't complain and they shouldn't expect the state to do it. The state simply does two things, in my opinion: opportunity and security. So that's the kind of thing I believe in. So I'm not a fan of the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't demonize them either. I try to have a scholarly approach and know their pluses and minuses. They're not a violent organization. They're not a violent organization. And they're not Iran. They're not the Taliban. They're kind of like evangelical Christians here in the United States in the Bible Belt. They're conservative. They're socially conservative. They're religiously conservative. They believe that Muslims or Islam has more to do with government than the average Egyptian does. So just as people here believe the Bible somehow has influenced the Constitution more than the average American does. That's where it's at. But it's not. The demonization seen in the United States is a caricature. It's an exaggeration. It's not rooted in facts. At least not in the last 50 years. Nonetheless, I stand in the opposite direction as far as the politics are concerned. I'm more on the liberal side of things. And I also believe that, and this is ironic because as a Muslim activist in the United States, I'm often accused of being, and this is, I should say, it's from the right wing exclusively that I receive these accusations, or smears as I call them, of being Muslim Brotherhood or pro-Hamas, or even Hamas myself. You'll see that on some blogs. And it's ironic because, number one, I'm against the politics of the Muslim Brotherhood and religious states in general. And number two, more than you're going even further, I believe in nonviolence. Now, I should say I believe in the right to violent resistance where there's violent aggression. But I believe that was practical perhaps in the days we were on horseback and we had swords and it would be a bunch of heathens attacking a village and the village had to defend itself, that kind of thing. But today, where we have nukes and we have these huge weapons and where it's a globalized world with large urban centers, it's just not going to work. I don't believe in that anymore. I believe in nonviolent resistance. That's what gets the results. I believe in it for Palestine. I believe it's the only way to freedom for the Palestinians in the territories. I'm anti-occupation, and that's probably why I get branded as Hamas by the far right, Jews or Christians. But I believe in equality and freedom and justice. I believe in the 1967 borders, two-state solution, and a nonviolence way to get there. That's as far as Israel is concerned. As far as Egypt is concerned, democracy, liberal democracy that allows for religious freedoms, both from Copts and Muslims. And I believe in equal rights for minorities. Muslims here, and Copts in Egypt. It's been great talking to you. I hope this has been helpful. Please stay in touch. If there are any opportunities that we can work together on, I'd be happy to do that. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Ahmed. And thanks to our three respondents, Kramer, Paul Wee, and Ronit Avni. It's really been a really inspiring and rich conversation today. Thank you. We'll end with just a few announcements. Please join us for our next webinar on Wednesday, September 14th at 10 a.m. U.S. Central Time, featuring Rabbi Alan Goshen-Gottstein, who will be joining us from Jerusalem. He's on equipping religious leaders for an interreligious work. For more information, please visit our website at parliamentofreligions.org. We also invite you to stay connected to the interreligious movement through our email newsletter and by visiting our social network at peacenext.org. We have been recording the webinar today, and the recording will be available on the website in the next few days if you'd like to review it or share it with others. So once again, we extend our thanks out to our presenters and to all of you listeners for doing your own part for a better world. And once again, on behalf of the people, thank you all for joining us.